My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 32, and I work as a licensed home inspector. For 11 months, my grandfather Walter spent every Saturday helping me restore a neglected two-bedroom craftsman house I finally bought for $318,400 after saving for nearly a decade. At exactly 7:43 p.m. on April 18, my phone vibrated with a message that turned every fresh coat of paint into something strangely fragile. Months later, I stood in my own kitchen, staring at a brass key resting beside a cracked blue coffee mug, while my mother waited silently on the porch. What she didn't know that evening wasn't just why I bought the house alone. It was why that brass key would eventually become the only thing neither of us could pretend belonged to someone else. Growing up, our family never ranked people openly. We ranked them by keys. My parents always held the master keys to the family cabin, my grandmother's storage unit, even spare keys to relatives' homes. My mother liked saying that whoever held the keys carried the responsibility. Looking back, I realized the keys really represented permission to control everyone else's decisions. Grandpa Walter never cared about that system. At 74, he still carried the same scratched tape measure in his shirt pocket and smelled faintly of cedar wood from his workshop. Every Saturday morning at 8:00 a.m., he'd arrive with 2 coffees and quietly teach me how to replace trim, repair drywall, or level old cabinets. He insisted every room deserved patience, not perfection. I wish I could say I always defended him when my parents dismissed him as old-fashioned. I didn't. I laughed at jokes I should have challenged. I stayed quiet when my mother rearranged his plans because arguing felt exhausting. I told myself keeping peace was kindness, when really it was convenience. That silence became part of the foundation we all stood on. By early April, every document was already signed. My realtor, Jenna Morales, emailed the final closing schedule on April 9th at 10:14 a.m. I replied with both my parents copied, confirming the closing date of April 18. During Sunday lunch, I mentioned it again in front of my Aunt Denise and cousin Ethan. Nobody objected. Nobody asked questions. As we walked toward the front porch after lunch, my mother smiled almost absent-mindedly and said, "Big decisions belong to the family." I remember thinking she meant congratulations. I didn't realize it was a warning. Closing took less than 45 minutes. At 3:52 p.m., I signed the final document, accepted the brass key from the title agent, and drove straight to the house. Grandpa Walter was already there, hanging a simple wooden shelf we'd built together from reclaimed oak. The smell of fresh paint mixed with sawdust, and for the first time in years, I felt like my future occupied a real address instead of a dream. At exactly 7:43 p.m., my phone lit up with a family group text from my mother. Asterisk, why would you buy a house without consulting us? Asterisk. A second message appeared before I could answer. Asterisk, we already had plans for that house. Big decisions belong to the family. Asterisk. I stared at the screen, then looked across the room where Grandpa was carefully placing the last framed photo onto the fireplace mantel. 2 years of saving, 11 months of repairs, and one quiet evening suddenly felt as if someone else was trying to write themselves into the ownership papers. I called my father first. He answered on the second ring. "We assumed you'd let us move in after retirement," he said matter-of-factly. "Your mother already told several people you'd bought a place big enough for everyone. We were going to renovate our current house and sell it next spring." I genuinely thought I had misunderstood. "You never asked me." His voice stayed calm. "We shouldn't have to ask. Big decisions belong to the family." The sentence landed harder the second time. Grandpa never asked what the messages said. He simply noticed my face, set his screwdriver down, and continued tightening the final shelf bracket before quietly saying, "Should I leave you alone for a while?" I hated that he even thought leaving was the respectful thing to do. He wasn't angry. He wasn't offended. He was preparing to make himself smaller inside a house he had helped build. That hurt more than if he'd shouted. As he packed his toolbox, memories began lining up with uncomfortable precision. The college savings account my parents borrowed from because my younger brother supposedly needed it more. The used car I'd purchased myself that somehow became the family vehicle every holiday. The apartment lease they volunteered me to co-sign for a cousin without asking. Every incident had been wrapped in the same language about family responsibility. I had mistaken repeated surrender for maturity. Looking back honestly, I wasn't only the person being overruled. I had helped normalize it by agreeing whenever resistance felt uncomfortable. The pattern survived because I kept smoothing its edges. The next morning, I called my older sister, Melissa. She sighed before I finished explaining. You know how mom gets? Just let them think they'll stay there sometimes. It doesn't have to become a fight. It sounded practical. It also sounded exactly like every compromise that had slowly erased my own choices. Around lunchtime, I met my Aunt Denise for coffee. She stirred her tea for nearly a minute before speaking. They're embarrassed because they already told everyone what was happening. If you push back now, people will gossip. Not one sentence asked what I wanted. Not one question acknowledged that my name alone appeared on the deed. When I returned home, Grandpa Walter was sanding the porch railing he'd promised to finish. Without looking up, he asked one quiet question. Claire, is this your house? Yes. Then start acting like someone who believes that. He went back to sanding as though he'd only commented on the weather. Oddly enough, those 12 words gave me more permission than anyone in my family ever had. That evening I called my parents. I offered the simplest compromise I could imagine. You'll always be welcome to visit. I'll even set up the guest room however you'd like. But this is my home, and no one is moving in permanently. There were several seconds of silence. Then my mother laughed. Not kindly. So you're choosing a house over your parents? I'm choosing the life I worked for. No, she replied. You're choosing selfishness. If you don't fix this, we'll tell everyone exactly how ungrateful you've become. Your brother won't visit. Holidays will be different. Don't expect this family to pretend nothing happened. It wasn't about bedrooms. It wasn't about retirement. It wasn't even about the house. It was about who held the key. I stopped trying to negotiate my place inside a system that only worked when I surrendered it. The next morning, I bought a small wooden key rack from a hardware store for $19.95 and mounted it beside the front door. There was one hook for my brass house key and 3 empty hooks for guests. I realized something that felt almost embarrassingly simple. A home becomes peaceful the moment permission replaces expectation. I left one guest room completely furnished anyway. The invitation remained open. Control did not. That afternoon, I opened my laptop to write the message I had been avoiding. The first draft lasted exactly 3 sentences. Asterisk, you never planned my future. You planned how to use it. Asterisk. I deleted every word. The second draft was longer and angrier. Asterisk, the deed has one name on it because one person worked for it. Stop pretending my accomplishments belong to you. Asterisk. I read it once, closed my eyes, and highlighted the entire page. Delete. The message I finally sent at 6:18 p.m. was only 68 words. Asterisk, I love you both, and I hope you'll visit often. My home will always have room for guests who respect that it is my home. I'm not debating ownership or future living arrangements anymore. If you'd like a relationship with me, I'd like that too. But it has to begin with respecting this decision. Asterisk. My mother's reply arrived 4 minutes later. Asterisk, do what you want. Asterisk. Nothing else. No questions. No congratulations. Just 4 cold words that somehow carried years of disappointment. I expected relief after pressing send. Instead, I felt quiet. Not victorious. Just finished. 6 weeks later, on May 31, Grandpa Walter hosted the first gathering in the backyard. The folding chairs didn't match. The grill refused to light on the first attempt. My friend Nina accidentally dropped an entire bowl of potato salad onto the patio stones, and everyone laughed while cleaning it together. The evening felt imperfect in every visible way and peaceful in every invisible one. Before anyone ate, Grandpa reached into his pocket and handed me the spare brass key we had cut the week before. You decide who receives copies from now on, he said. I slipped it onto the wooden key rack without saying much. Across town, according to my cousin Ethan, my parents were hosting one of their carefully planned dinner parties. Crystal glasses covered the table. Matching linen napkins sat beside polished silverware. Several guests had quietly canceled after learning there had been family tension. The evening looked elegant in photographs, but felt strangely empty, at least from everything Ethan later described. The biggest surprise came near sunset. Grandpa walked over to the raised garden bed we'd built together and carefully planted the first tomato seedlings. "I've never had room for a proper garden," he said with a smile. Watching him kneel in soil that belonged to no one but me felt like the real housewarming. For months he had repaired walls, measured windows, and carried lumber without asking for recognition. Now he was finally planting something that would outlast the renovation itself. People congratulated me on buying the house. But the quiet victory belonged to him. Even so, I never called it winning. Some nights I still reached for my phone before remembering there would be no invitation to Sunday dinner. Holidays became smaller. Familiar traditions disappeared almost overnight. Silence has its own weight, especially when it settles where family routines used to live. A few weeks later, Aunt Denise stopped by with a loaf of homemade banana bread. She stood on the porch longer than usual before speaking. "Your mother grew up believing love meant staying needed," she said softly. "Her parents controlled everything, and she mistook that for closeness." It explained more than I expected. It excused nothing. As she left, I looked once more at the brass key hanging quietly on its hook. Some inherit houses. Others inherit the arguments about who should own them. I decided the inheritance would stop with me. 3 months after the barbecue, my mother arrived without calling. It was 9:12 a.m. on a Saturday. I saw her sedan through the front window while I was helping Grandpa Walter label jars of tomato sauce from the garden. I could have opened the door immediately. Instead, I finished tightening the lid on the last jar, washed my hands, and let her wait exactly 6 minutes. For the first time in my life, our conversation happened at my pace. She began with familiar territory. "You've embarrassed the family." When that earned nothing more than a quiet look, she tried another approach. "I suppose your father and I just don't matter anymore." That failed too. Her shoulders lowered in a way I had never seen before. After a long silence, she asked one question that sounded nothing like the woman who had repeated, "Big decisions belong to the family." When did you stop trusting us? I answered honestly. I stopped trusting that my choices would still belong to me after I shared them. She nodded without arguing. Then I told her there was only one condition if we were going to rebuild anything. "It doesn't start with me. It starts with Grandpa Walter. He spent 11 months helping build this home, and you treated him like he was standing in the way of your plans. Before we talk about us, you need to make that right." She looked toward the backyard where he was trimming tomato vines. She walked outside. I stayed inside. Whatever they said belonged to them, not to my story. I only know they talked for nearly 40 minutes. I saw tears in both their eyes when they returned, but I never asked for the details. Some conversations become meaningful precisely because they remain private. A year later, Saturday mornings looked completely different. The old obligation-filled Sunday lunches were gone. Instead, every first Saturday of the month, whoever wanted to come brought breakfast to my house. There were no assigned seats, no rankings, no assumptions about who held the important key. Guests hung their own keys on the empty hooks beside mine before coming inside. My mother always knocked now. The first time she handed me a small potted rosemary plant instead of advice, I noticed she waited for me to invite her across the doorway. It was a tiny gesture. It meant everything. Grandpa Walter expanded the garden that spring, joking that the tomatoes finally had an address as permanent as mine. The brass key still hangs beside the cracked blue coffee mug where I placed it on the first night. It reminds me that 11 months of work, $318, 400 dream, and one decision made at 7:43 p.m. taught me something no deed ever could. A house becomes a home the moment love stops demanding a key and starts waiting to be invited inside.